very much for coming along this afternoon and for joining us for our September webinar. So a few housekeeping bits. Obviously, cameras and mics are off because that's primarily because we've got a large audience. But please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions. There is a Q&A section, but not everybody can see that if you add them. It's only Catherine and I could see that. So best to just pop everything in the chat box and we'll go through. There should be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. The session will be about 45 minutes time. Hopefully you've got your cuppa and your notepad ready, or maybe your lunch. I'm sure that you're going to get some really great takeaways from this afternoon's session. So all that's left for me to do is to introduce you to our speaker today. I'm sure some of you have already met Catherine Betley. Catherine is the wearer of a number of different hats, running a professional counselling service, Grief Chat, and also head of MuchLoved Charitable Trust. So very, very used to speaking to bereaved people, so really understands the language and the tone to use with them. So that's what she's going to be sharing with us this afternoon, sharing her expertise and research on the best language, look and tone to ensure this connection with your in-memory supporters. So I will be quiet now and hand you over to Catherine.
Thank you very much. And the first thing to check is you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Probably not so much the pinging that's still going on.
Yeah, sorry, I'll try and measure the pinging.
In the meantime, I will share my screen. Here we go. And launch the slideshow. So hopefully you can now all see that. And while I'm speaking, it is quite a short webinar session today of only 45 minutes. So there is a little bit of content. There will be a little bit of time to ask questions via the chat box. And Sally will try and keep an eye on that for me. And I guess to start with the caveats, really, because as Sally said, I'm the head of charity at MuchLoved, and I also run something called Grief Chat. But what I'm not is a web designer or a brand expert or a linguist even. But I am somebody who spent a number of years speaking to many, many bereaved people and listening to their stories and trying to figure out how best to support them as well. So this webinar today is really coming from a perspective of the things that we found help bereaved people in their journey. And most of it you'll already know. It might sound a little bit like teaching you how to suck eggs on occasion, on account of the fact that actually if you're working regularly, routinely in comms, in marketing, in fundraising, on websites, a lot of this stuff you've probably already learned previously, or you might already know, but it's the prompt to really go back and start reviewing what you've got already, or if you're planning something new, and think really carefully about how this might land with your bereaved supporters. So in that sense, I'm not here to tell you what to do or even how to do it really, but just to raise those questions that I hope will be quite thought-provoking around how to kind of connect with the people who are landing on your in-memory pages. If I can get the screen to move, that would be helpful. So, what we're going to talk about, connecting with the donors. Who are these people who are finding their way onto your website? You know what they're looking for, and hopefully you know how to facilitate getting them to where they want to be. The language, the words, the look and feel, the tone, the images, the colours, all of those kinds of things, to really just to kind of prompt you to go back and with a fresh set of eyes, or even somebody else's eyes, have a look at what you've already got within your charity, which will be shaped by all kinds of factors, including the kind of general look and feel of your charity, the audience that you perceive is arriving on those pages and what they want to enact, and your budget and your resources and your skills and your expertise, how long your charity's been there, your history, and all of that stuff as well. We have a very quick case study. We had hoped that Fisherman's Mission would be joining us today. They're quite a new partner of MuchLoved. And I spoke in some depth to Andy, who's their head of In Memory and Legacy fundraising, about how he'd gone about thinking through the look and feel and tone of his pages. They've not actually launched their tribute fund quite yet, but they've certainly got new In Memory pages that we can have a quick look at. And I also spoke to Maggie, who is our head of creative here at MuchLoved. Maggie's had a very long and an illustrious career in creativity and design, and I thought she'd be a really good person to speak to, in as much as she's the person who's been largely responsible for capturing the look and feel that we've adopted from MuchLoved. So a few words from Maggie as well. But without further ado, and then the time for the questions and answers, hopefully. And again, because I'm not kind of a website person or necessarily a designer, hopefully less technical questions, please, and more questions around, what about this and what about that, and how about this for bereaved people, and that kind of the emotional content side of things. It would be my area of expertise particularly. But if you do have any technical questions, we will certainly try and get somebody to answer them in due course and come back to you. So really thinking through, who are you talking to? Who is your audience? Because the audience that lands on your In Mem pages might not necessarily be the same audience that lands on your About Our Charity, what we do, information and support, our services. Might be slightly different cohort to that main website cohort, because more often than not, people who land on In Memory pages are there to transact something very specific. And the reason that they are there is what you might call a distress purchase in lots of ways. It's a little bit like, I don't necessarily want to be here. This is not the place I wanted to find myself this Tuesday morning, because I don't really want to be thinking about somebody has died and I need to make a donation, or I need to set up a funeral donations page, or I need to donate to a tribute fund, because necessarily they're difficult subjects. And it's a sad reason to be there. But hopefully when they land on your page, they land there with some hope to make a difference, to remember somebody, to reflect who that person was. So slightly different audience to the general audience that might land on your other pages on your website. So a big crossover, of course, but a very specific cohort of people, really. So we're talking about the immediate loved ones of someone who may be dying or has died quite recently, their friends, their acquaintances, their work colleagues. There is a very emotional connection between those people and somebody who is no longer physically present with them. So what I say a lot of the time in our bereavement training is it's not necessarily a connection between those bereaved people and your charity at that point. The connection is between those bereaved people and the person who's died. So we kind of need to reflect that really a little bit. So how might they be feeling? So necessarily, possibly not as full of the joys of spring as they might be otherwise. They might be feeling heightened emotion. We know that certainly in other realms that bereaved people bring with them emotion that can spill over. So if things are difficult or if they are not pleased with what you offer, sometimes you can get a bit of kickback to that. So we know in other dimensions that bereaved people have a higher propensity to comment or complain about things that are not helpful to them. So those heightened emotions may give rise to feelings that initially we want to kind of hold and hopefully move towards kind of a positive, more sort of hopeful connection with your charity, with your website. They might be feeling a bit trepidatious as well. The last thing I want to be doing this Tuesday morning is setting up a tribute fund to my person who's died. And I'm nervous about this, and it's going to trigger some emotion for me. And I don't really know how to do it. And all over the place, really. So there's a lot of feelings there in that sense before they kind of even land on your In Memory pages. So as I'm trying to get to your pages, I don't want to be frustrated by not being able to find what I want. I don't want to be thwarted by a ton of text that my brain can't cope with. And what I want to feel when I land on that right page, it's kind of a warm hug, really, the minute I get there, or some safe space, which I think, okay, I can do this. So how they get to your pages, how many clicks, where, do you need to actually put stuff in the search box? I do look at loads and loads of in-memory pages as part of some of the work that I do, and certainly for the research for this, I have looked at a lot. And sometimes I've had to literally search for some stuff to find it, and that's kind of not ideal really in that sense. So hopefully no more than 2 or 3 clicks to get to where I need to be. So you're giving me really clear instructions to find what I need. And I know that many charities, because I've spoken to them about Grief Chat in the past, are quite nervous about acknowledging front and centre that sometimes people who are connected to our charity or supported by our charity may well die of this condition. They may well die when they're in our care. People do die generally without any particular connection to this charity, and we need somewhere to reflect that, because we want to capture those people who want to support us because they've got that in memory reason. So giving them the simplest way of navigating can sometimes feel quite hard, because you probably don't want it front and centre of your homepage, but it has to be really easy to find. And then how would you like them to feel when they get there? It is that kind of initial welcome. You're in the right place. We will help you do what you need to do, and it's okay. And then also, what action? Because presumably, if people are on your donate pages, particularly donating memory pages, set up a tribute fund pages, these are actions. And the other thing that I always say in our bereavement training is never be afraid to invite bereaved people to take action, whether that is to donate, to set up a tribute fund, to do something. Because what can you do when there's nothing you can do? You just want to do something, don't you? So a lot of people find great catharsis in setting up tribute funds, in donating in memory, in setting up a funeral collection. It is something you can do when there's very little else that you can do to make this situation better. So you're looking to kind of prompt or facilitate, and I think that's the right word really, to facilitate that action from your in-memory space. So making that space very clear, simple to navigate, and like that warm, kind of hug-safe space when you get there. And how might you do that? Because that's a big ask, in line with the resources that you have, the skills that you have, the design or web design skills that you have, and also within your existing brand. Because certainly one of the things that I've noticed as I've gone through lots and lots of in-memory pages is sometimes the kind of upbeat, positive, forward-looking charities, which a lot are, quite rightly, sometimes that kind of, it's really difficult to follow through into your in-mem pages that probably need to be a little more reflective, yes, positive and hopeful, and making something good out of something bad, but kind of toning that down a little bit. And sometimes with the colours that we use as well, and the language that we use, it's a really hard balancing act. So really thinking about, how do you capture within your in-mem space your existing brand and your existing tone, and how does that work? And does it work? And if not, what are you going to do about it? So let's start with language, because words matter, language matters. We know that what we say to bereaved people is important, but in the old Maya Angelou tradition, people won't remember what you said, they won't remember what you did, but they will remember how you made them feel. But when you land on a website, you've got very few other ways of helping people to feel that are not language, colour, images. So in that sense, you really have to think very carefully about the language that we're going to use on our websites. Words can be triggering. Now, I work in death care and bereavement care. I use words like dead, dying, grief, loss, bereavement routinely. Most people don't, and lots of people are really uncomfortable with some of those words. So as much as I would say, avoid euphemisms, kind of be clear and direct, again, there is a balance to everything, isn't it? So in that sense, finding the right words for your supporter base. Certainly in counselling and therapy, we would mirror the words that people give to us. So if somebody says to me, somebody passed away, that would probably be the words that I would use back to them. But when you've got thousands of people landing on a website, actually choosing the words that you use is really, really important. And again, within our charities, we use shorthand, don't we? We've got shorthand for everything. We've got our own kind of language that we use to kind of get to where we need to be. And sometimes that follows through to our written communications as well. So that technical, clinical, corporate language can sometimes follow through to pages where it just doesn't land quite as well as it might do on your clinical or technical pages, or your corporate pages. So in that sense, kind of reviewing the words that we use, I think the rule of thumb is to kind of write for an age 10-year-old, so that people can easily understand. And that's not to be condescending or downplaying the complexity of what people might have encountered, but just really kind of taking account of the fact that usually heightened emotion means less patience or less ability to kind of take in lots and lots of information. And what bereaved people get when somebody dies, particularly if you're a next of kin or very close family, you kind of get bombarded with lots of stuff. So actually keeping the language simple and using fewer words and short sentences can be really, really helpful without making it too simplistic. Again, it's that balance, isn't it? And there is definitely such a thing. I don't think it's a kind of a term that kind of we use in general language again, but grief brain is real. If you've ever been bereaved, and I was bereaved this year quite significantly, and it's something I'd not really experienced for a long time, so things just don't work the way that they would normally work, because we're overloaded with information and with unfamiliar, hopefully, emotions, and we think about things in a slightly different way. Grief does change the way we perceive the world. So grief brain, where you're just overloaded and overwhelmed and overtired and overstressed, is real. So I think we really have to take that into account. And my other ask in lots of ways is that whatever you put on your website, please fact check it. Still all over the internet, we have things like the stages of grief. Kubler-Ross, who wrote The Stages of Grief, said the stages of grief were never meant to tuck messy emotions into neat packages. The stages of grief were written about people who were dying, not people who were bereaved. And it's been disproved in research terms many times over. But we still kind of lead people into these models because we're kind of familiar with the pop culture, sort of slightly glib, these are the stages of grief. So if we're going to talk about things, then we should be using the more well-established stuff. And inclusive language as well, because we're in a world now that is totally global. And I can tell you just from sometimes the experiences that we have at Grief Chat of watching bereaved people land on your website and access Grief Chat, those people are from all over the world. And you have absolutely kind of no idea how far your message spreads, which is amazing. So we have to write for all. This is what we do at MuchLoved. We write for all as best we can. And we have to take into account those diverse experiences of grief. Just because you are a cancer charity does not necessarily follow that everybody who's on your mem pages has been bereaved by cancer. I think it's pretty good to assume that some of them will be, for sure. Not all of them. People will be motivated by all kinds of different types of grief and different types of loss. And there'll be different kinds of people with a different kind of outlook on the world. So assuming nothing is really important. We know that we want to sound empathic and non-judgmental and welcoming of all. And actually kind of reflecting that in the words that we use is really, again, a really delicate balancing act sometimes. And we also know that, because, anybody who's seen Donald Trump in the recent years who types solely in capital letters, we know that things like punctuation, typography, use of italics, capitalization, those paralinguistic or extra-linguistic cues can really shape the look and feel of the words that we use and actually also trigger emotions. There's something called emotional contagion. So if you use very emotive or provocative language, and you can use punctuation, typography to elicit more of a response, we need to be really careful about doing that. I think it's always really important to remember that bereaved people are already sensitized. We don't necessarily need to be leading people down a massively emotional road. They're already emotional when they get there. And also the kind of practical, do long, didn't read. So kind of really picking out carefully the phrases that are most important, the things that we really want people to pay attention to, keeping it simple, but also maybe making those phrases stand out somewhere, either by colour or bold text or different font or however it might be. And so making sure that people can grab the stuff, the donate button, the set up a tribute fund button, the get help button, whatever it might be, can really grab that stuff quite quickly as soon as they navigate to your site. In terms of tone, again, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because we're kind of sometimes stuck with what we've got. So unless you're writing a whole new website or you've got permission to change the colours and the images and all that stuff, you kind of get stuck into a brand, a tone for your charity. And actually just manipulating that a little bit, kind of soften it up or whatever you want to do with it can be quite tricky within the resources that we've got. But really thinking about, what are these pages saying to me? What is the tone of what is there already and what do we want it to say? Because we want it to be thoughtful and compassionate. We want it to be probably warm and gentle. We might want it to be positive and uplifting. We definitely want to validate people's experiences. We want to acknowledge their emotional state. We don't need to assume any specifics around why you might feel that way. But we definitely want to validate that people are there, usually necessarily to remember somebody or to do something positive because something very difficult has happened. We want to use languages and images that respect those diverse relationships, people's cultures, people's different grief experiences. And very often, and this is not wrong at all, but very often we kind of go to something a little bit neutral. And I'll come on to that in a second or two, which is fine if that's the tone that you want to capture. It really is a thinking through, how do I want people to feel? What are these images going to tell people? Do they kind of quite sit with the words? Do they quite sit with what we want people to do or think about? And also being non-directive but guiding. The people who are landing on those pages on your website normally need to do something. And again, one of the things I say in the bereavement training is, particularly when it's the very early stages of a loss, particularly if I want to set up something like a funeral donation fund, if you make me do more things than I can cope with, I will not do them. I will just kind of back off and kind of, I can't do this, it's too much. So if you're making me click a million times, if you're making me fill in very long forms, if you're making me pick up the phone sometimes and speak to people, it can be too much. So making things as simple as possible, particularly, I would say, in those very early days of bereavement, making things as easy as possible for your cohort of bereaved people. So not directive, but guiding gently through. And that tone is reflected by the language, the typography, the layouts, the colours, the images used. It's all of the things that kind of bring together the look and feel that will shape actually how people feel when they land on those pages to transact those kind of important things. Poor design example. Well, this is a really good slide because it's a poor design. But I think it's probably it's like a kind of a do's and don'ts really in that sense. And just to go very quickly through, it's difficult because if your charity has those bright saturated colours, or you might even choose to use them. We certainly did in Grief Chat, just mainly because I was fatigued by all of the sort of soft muted colours. So we went for an orange and a blue. MuchLoved has a much more soft and muted sort of purple tones, but still some vibrancy in there as well. But actually, if you're stuck with really jarring colours for your charity, how do you kind of warm them up or soften them round or whatever it might be? That layout, certainly we're doing a lot of work at the minute making pages much clearer, removing some of the clutter, like this slide, too many words, too much going on, too much, can't read it. And also those kind of excitable calls to action are probably not appropriate. So you might have that excitable call to action on your run a marathon page, for example. You probably don't want quite the same look and feel on your donating memory page. So that kind of like exclamation point thing and things in capitals you probably want to stay away from. Again, the complex menus, navigation, small, hard to read fonts by accessibility, not just accessibility to a wide range of cultures and experiences, but also people who are using accessibility equipment, maybe readers to read your webpage. How do people navigate? Can we see it? Can we read it? Can we understand it? And then the overall feeling. And I think sometimes, because we're so engrossed in our own work, it's usually more helpful to get some other people to read it and tell you how that page makes them feel. Because I'll read my own page and go, yeah, they're fine. That says exactly what I wanted to say. When actually somebody who might be bereaved or might not know your charity or might not know your cause might go, I don't know what that means. Or actually, that makes me feel slightly nervous or whatever it might be. And the impact that those things have. So what we're looking for are, how do we translate that tone of voice, that clear, directional, professional tone of voice that we would normally use to something a little warmer, a little more empathic, a little more taking people with us rather than directing them places. What is our layout going to be, the navigation, the typography? I think you can have the slides. I'll check with Sally if you particularly want to go back to this slide. So in the course of the research, I looked at loads and loads of in-mem pages. Don't ask me why. This is the one that stood out to me, and it's completely and utterly personal to me. I don't know why. I loved this image of a family of whales swimming together. I love the ocean. I didn't know I was particularly drawn to whales, but I really love this. So I think in lots of ways it's about finding the images and the tones and things that actually really appeal to you in some ways. But all of the things that I went through, and what I really noticed is that other than reflecting the charity brand, which most people do extremely well, and again, it's that real delicate balancing act between taking the normal corporate brand and translating it for this audience. What I expected to see, I thought I'd see some sad stuff, some sad faces, some reflections of grief. And actually, I was really pleased, kind of not to on the whole. What I really saw were images and themes and tones of kindness, of beauty, memories, hope. There were lots of reflections of a theory of grief that we call continuing bonds. How do we continue the relationship with somebody after they've died? And tribute funds are very much a reflection of continuing that story, that narrative, that relationship. So how do we hold that relationship at the heart of this transaction, in that sense, or this website? I saw a lot of support other people in your situation, pay it forward kinds of messages, leave a legacy to support other families who are like yours, make something good about something really difficult. All of that stuff I saw reflected in people's in-mem pages, which was ace. And also things like people, lots of images of relationships, people, love, companionship, hand-holding, and also the kind of more existential stuff as well. So there are a lot of flowers, a lot of landscape, a lot of nature, a lot of stars and wonderment. So we actually kind of gravitate towards really lovely reflective themes. So that, I think, again, if you get the chance to go and have a look at a whole bunch of other people's websites, it's a really interesting exercise. Very often we pick things that are very tangible to our charity. So if we've got, for example, a hospice with a garden, and it's got a beautiful garden, it's got some lavender in, whatever it might be, images that reflect those things, the forget-me-nots, could be the whales. If you're a nature kind of conservation type charity, you might reflect that kind of stuff. But it was lovely. But on the whole, what I saw was that charities were very much reflecting relationships, and I think that's quite right and proper. So a little case study. I had a chat with Andy from the Fisherman's Mission, who was hoping to be here today to explain himself to you. And it was really interesting because I've had a few chats with people, and quite a lot of this stuff feels very intangible. It's how it made me feel when we were writing this page, the words that felt right to us, the images that just thought, yeah, that works. A lot of it is really intangible and a little bit unscientific in some ways. But what Andy told me he'd really tried hard to do was to reflect the look and feel of the charity. So Fisherman's Mission help the families of fishermen and fishermen when they've retired or they're sick or injured or whatever it might be. So there were obviously nautical themes going on, beaches and boats and fish and stuff. So he was reflecting the general overall look and feel of the charity, which I think most people would do, using very simple typography and quite simple words as well. The muted image, much more so on this page than on the home page. The home page is a jolly looking fisherman with a dog, right up my street, to be fair, the dog. You know, it was very obvious. The home page image was very different in tone and character to this particular page, which is family, relationships, love, legacy, carrying things into the future, that kind of thing. And the colours are slightly more muted on this section as well. And then the words of welcome, chosen really carefully, about meaningful tributes and providing lifelines and remembering loved ones. Those kinds of gentle words that really kind of encourage people to connect with your charity. But really, in lots of ways, you know, what Andy was telling me was that he wanted to make it really simple, really easy to navigate. He wanted to reflect the charity language, that they use some really emotive language, things like an ocean of memories is what their tribute fund will be called, and words that really resonated with him and with the charity itself. And he also uses quite a bit of video content and some illustrations as well to kind of show people through their journey. Conscious of time, so I won't kind of go on too long about that one. So finally, really, I had a chat with Maggie from MuchLoved, because I think she's captured really well, as MuchLoved has developed over the last 20 some years, a real look and feel of keeping the bereaved person at the heart of everything we do, but actually remembering the person that's died is front and centre of everything that MuchLoved does. So I asked Maggie kind of how she'd gone about doing that. And essentially what she tried to explain to me was, it's not the grief thing that we want to reflect on so much. The grief is there. The grief is there whether or not we like it, and whether or not we want it. And it's not for me to kind of remind people of their grief, remind people of their loss. He said, but everything comes from that. It comes from the love. You know, you probably saw on the internet recently, I think All on the Board put on Facebook yesterday, the Colin Park or Queen Elizabeth quote about grief is the price we pay for love. So we know the grief is there. That's necessary in the circumstances that we've got to some degree. But that's not what we're about, and that's not what necessarily in Mem fundraising is about. Everything stems from love, from relationship, from memory, from holding that person at the centre. So that's what she said. She was trying to reflect that, communicate it, not being maudlin or being too kind of excitable about it, not trying to evoke that sadness, but trying to reflect those relationships and that love, and keeping the human at the heart of everything. And one of the things she said that really kind of I liked a lot, we're not in the business of making people more sad than they already feel. And actually that's I think where a lot of our charities that I've looked at, you know, that kind of hope, that connection, that meaningful stuff kind of comes from, is that actually we know that this is a difficult place, a difficult point in time. So what we're trying to do is give you the tools to try to make sense of that experience, to make a meaningful investment out of that experience, to support other people, to do something. And there's very little else you can do to make that situation better. And Maggie also said, it's got a lot of me in it. And as much as sometimes we put professional head on and we do our best to kind of depersonalise stuff, I think actually some of the best communications, the best websites, the best messages will have lots of you in it as well. You know, it's got to, you know, one of the things we say in bereavement comms training, I can say things my way and only you can say things your way. So you will have views and you will have particular words and phrases. And as long as they translate to a broad set of people, then that's fine. It's got a lot of you in it. It's got a lot of love in it. It will probably make sense to people. And finally, what she said was, there is a book, if you were interested in web design and design kind of principles generally, that she said, I've had it for years. This is the second or third version of it. And she refers to it frequently. So Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think, she said it refers to it every day. It's always on the desk. And it's essentially her Bible. not mine, because I'm not a web designer, but that's what she told me. She relies on pretty heavily. I'm going to stop there. And if anyone's put any questions in the question or the chat section or has any comments, if you want to share some wisdom, that would be wonderful. Just stop the screen share. Very quick go up through that there, Sally.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. There were a couple of questions, one which we are going to pick up outside of this because it was just needed a bit more kind of context. A request to share the slides, so we will do that. We're recording the session, so I'll put that on the support site for those of the audience that are partners, and also you'll be able to access a copy of the presentation there as well, of Catherine's slides. That's about it so far. So if anyone has got any other comments or questions whilst we've got Catherine and her expertise here, and please do pop them in the chat box. You're probably all quickly Googling that book.
I did earlier on. It's on Amazon. It's pretty cheap actually. It's not too bad at all.
Oh, there you go. Ruth was asked if
pages that stands out. There were loads actually, Ruth. In that sense, there were really loads. And some, but I don't know why that Wales particular one. I normally wouldn't necessarily think of whale conservation as something I would donate to, but I just loved the feel of it, the feel of the ocean, and so there weren't any. Sally sent me loads to have a look at in the course of this research, and they were all good and they were all thoughtful. I don't think for a minute that anybody who works in this field doesn't think really hard about what they put in on the websites. And it is the key to it all just seems to be striking that balance between the corporate brand and the messaging that you would normally use, and just thinking very carefully how that would land with somebody who is maybe a little bit more distressed, maybe has a slightly different view of the world at that point in time, maybe needs to make a transaction, but it's a gentle transaction. And that balance between, how do we reflect that in those pages particularly? But there were just so many that were really, 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 really good and super thoughtful. And whatever you chose, whether it was flowers or sunsets or birds or whatever, the images kind of, as long as they fitted in with the theme of the website and they reflected where you wanted people to get to, they kind of all worked.
There's a really great question here from Fiona about advice on how to promote tribute pages on or in MEM or dedication pages, which are obviously part of our service, on social media sensitively. I think there's a lot of reticence about promoting anything in MEM on social media.
Yeah. And that's one of my particular soapboxes. I spent a lot of time with care teams in lots of different charities, trying to convince them why it's not a bad thing to, you should never, ever, ever be afraid of allowing bereaved people to get involved in fundraising, because it's one of those things that we find cathartic, that, we can harness some of the energy that we've got, because there's a lot of energy flying around. It's the nature of emotion, isn't it? That, we kind of get itchy and twitchy and want to do things, even though we are exhausted and tired and sad perhaps. But we should never be afraid to say to people, you can harness some of that and give something back to change things for the people. It's a real gift for a lot of people. Tribute funds are a real gift for a lot of people. Being able to remember. Grief invites us to remember, not to forget. And that's exactly what you're doing in the work that you're doing. So I always say to care teams, we are giving people really good opportunities to remember. It's not about the money. Yes, that's part of it. And people are very, very motivated to run marathons and do cake sales and host pub quizzes and do things to reflect the person that they've lost, the love that is there. So in that sense, around kind of social media, a lot of it is about remembering. A lot of it is about passing around, kind of that opportunity for people to do something at a really difficult time, and harnessing that love, the stuff that we've talked about. It's not necessarily about the grief. It's more about the remembering, the holding that person close, the love that kind of experience it, and finding ways to communicate that stuff.
So are you still with us, Catherine? You seem to have you're still with us. Excellent.
Definitely still with you.
Even a bit glitchy. Another question around considering visitors outside the in memory and bereaved audience, such as funeral directors who may be looking for information on how to help facilitate sending donations. That's an interesting question. I wouldn't have thought, Catherine might agree or disagree with me, but I wouldn't have thought that should be your priority, because the funeral director will just look at your address details on your website. I would have thought a lot of them have their own ways of collecting and processing donations, or they would just give the family a box for them to collect the donations physically at the funeral. A webinar for advice on sending out thank you correspondence is a good idea, Jo. We will pop it on the list.
Yeah. Another thing I'd like to do is so some of the questions around tips when you meet people in person. So you could come along to a bereavement, kind of communicating with bereaved people training that we do. And one of the things that I'm trying to bully Sally into at the minute is a drop-in session where you can just turn up and talk to me about sort of any bereavement related stuff that might be on your mind, whether it is, what do we say to people? Are these words okay? Does this email work? Who am I going to offend if I send out this or that? Or this happened and I felt. So just kind of a general chat for people to pop in and just ask questions that hopefully we might get there at some point in the not too distant future.
You heard it here first. We're going to make it happen now. There's a question around, is it better to use images that don't have people in? I'm thinking it could put people off if they can't relate to the people in the image.
I think that's the key, isn't it? It's reflecting a range of people. If you're going to use people, then using images that reflect the population, a wide range of people, different faces and different ages and different everything. So if we're going to use people, we shouldn't kind of keep it homogenous and use this group of white middle-aged middle-class people. We should use a range of young people and old people and white people and not white people and older people and younger. Yeah, just a range of faces, and reflecting reality.
So that brings us to the end of the session. So firstly, thank you very much, Catherine, for pulling together the content and sharing your experience with us. And thank you very much for attending the session this morning. And I keep saying that, this afternoon. I'll make sure that there's a recording on the support site for everyone to access, and I'll get Catherine to send me a copy of the slides so we can load that up as well. But yeah, thank you very much.